Little girl wets her pants. Teacher sees her bloated belly and calls 911. Immediately. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Room 114 at Pinewood Elementary buzzed with Monday morning energy. Children chatted about weekend adventures while settling into their desks. Emily Carter moved through the classroom with practiced ease, her warm smile masking the exhaustion from another weekend spent grading papers. "Good morning, everyone. Let's start our week with our sharing circle," Emily announced, her voice carrying that special blend of authority and kindness that had made her a favorite teacher for 8 years. As 23 children eagerly arranged their chairs, Emily's gaze drifted to the corner where Sophie Miller sat alone, clutching a worn teddy bear with a missing eye. Unlike the other first graders with their bright expressions, Sophie remained perfectly still, her oversized blue dress hanging loosely on her small frame. There was something about Sophie that had troubled Emily since the girl joined her class 3 weeks ago. It wasn't just her silence or the way she flinched at sudden movements. Today, Emily noticed something different, something concerning. Despite the baggy clothes, Sophie's midsection seemed unusually distended, and her complexion was alarmingly pale. "Sophie, would you like to join our circle today?" Emily asked gently, kneeling beside the girl's desk. Sophie shook her head slightly, her eyes fixed on the floor. Up close, Emily could see beads of sweat forming on the child's forehead despite the cool autumn air flowing through the windows. "Are you feeling okay, sweetheart?" Emily placed a gentle hand on Sophie's shoulder, alarmed by the heat radiating through the thin fabric. Again, no response, just the tightening of tiny fingers around the teddy bear's worn paw. Something wasn't right. In 8 years of teaching, Emily had developed an instinct for when a child was simply shy versus when something more serious was happening. "How about we get some water?" Emily suggested, helping Sophie to her feet. The girl wobbled slightly, her free arm wrapping protectively around her middle. As they walked toward the water fountain, Sophie suddenly stopped, her body going rigid. A small whimper escaped her lips as she doubled over. "Sophie? What's wrong?" Emily knelt down, her heart racing as she noticed a small dark spot spreading on Sophie's dress. The little girl's eyes widened with shame and fear. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the first words Emily had heard her speak clearly. "It's okay, accidents happen," Emily reassured her, but her concern deepened when she noticed Sophie's continued discomfort. Gently, she helped Sophie to the nurse's office, carrying her teddy bear in front to preserve the child's dignity. In the privacy of the nurse's office, Emily helped Sophie change into spare clothes. It was then that Emily saw what Sophie's baggy clothes had been hiding. Her abdomen was severely distended, with visible veins stretching across the taut skin. "Sophie, does your tummy hurt?" Emily asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite her growing alarm. Sophie clutched her bear tighter, her blue eyes filling with tears. After a long moment, she leaned closer to Emily and whispered 5 words that would change everything. "It's coming. The bad thing." A chill ran down Emily's spine. "What bad thing, sweetheart?" But Sophie had retreated back into silence, her small body trembling. The school nurse entered with a clipboard. "Sorry for the wait, we had a playground." She stopped mid-sentence when she saw Sophie's condition. One look was all it took. Within minutes, decisions were being made that would set in motion events neither Emily nor Sophie could have anticipated. "I'm calling 911, the nurse said firmly as they waited. Emily sat beside Sophie, holding her small hand. When the paramedics arrived, Sophie suddenly gripped Emily's hand with surprising strength. "Don't leave," she whispered, fear evident in her voice. In that moment, Emily made a decision that would alter the course of many lives, including her. "Don't worry, I won't," she promised, not yet understanding the weight of those 2 words or how they would bind her to this silent, mysterious child whose secrets were just beginning to unfold. The ambulance ride to St. Mary's Children's Hospital felt like the longest 15 minutes of Emily's life. Sophie lay still on the stretcher, her small hand never letting go of Emily's, while her other arm clutched her teddy bear against her chest. The paramedics worked quickly, checking vitals and asking questions that Emily couldn't answer. Has she complained of stomach pain before? Any history of medical conditions? Who's her primary guardian? All Emily knew was that Sophie lived with her grandmother, Nancy Miller. The school files contained minimal information, just an address in the older part of town and an emergency contact number that, according to the school secretary, frantically calling from Pinewood, wasn't answering. When they arrived at the hospital, Sophie was whisked away through double doors while Emily was directed to a waiting area and handed forms to fill out. She stared at the empty lines, feeling helpless. "Ms. Carter?" A woman in a white coat approached. "I'm Dr. Patel. We're examining Sophie now. Are you a relative?" "I'm her teacher," Emily explained. "Her grandmother couldn't be reached." Dr. Patel nodded, her expression softening. "We need to run some tests. Do you know anything about Sophie's home situation or medical history?" Emily shook her head. "She transferred to our school 3 weeks ago. She's barely spoken until today." "What did she say today?" Emily hesitated. "It's coming. The bad thing. That's all she said." Dr. Patel made a note in her chart. "We'll need to contact family services if we can't reach her guardian soon." Just as Emily was about to respond, an elderly woman hurried through the emergency room doors, leaning heavily on a cane. Her silver hair was disheveled, and her weathered face etched with panic. "Sophie Miller? Where's my granddaughter?" Her voice was thin but determined. Emily approached her gently. "Mrs. Miller? I'm Emily Carter, Sophie's teacher." The woman's eyes, the same striking blue as Sophie's, widened with recognition. "You called the ambulance. What happened to my Sophie?" Before Emily could explain, Dr. Patel introduced herself and guided Nancy to a quieter corner. Emily couldn't hear everything, but she caught fragments of the conversation. Words like severely malnourished and distended abdomen and testing for parasites. Nancy's face crumpled. "I give her everything I can," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Some days my hands shake so bad I can't open the medicine, head bottles or make proper meals. I thought she was just small for her age." Emily felt a pang in her heart as she watched this frail woman who clearly loved her granddaughter, but was struggling with her own limitations. An hour later, Emily sat with Nancy in Sophie's hospital room. The little girl was sleeping, connected to IV fluids, her teddy bear tucked beside her. The initial tests had confirmed severe malnutrition and a likely parasitic infection, treatable conditions, but ones that raised serious questions about Sophie's home environment. "I raised 2 boys on my own," Nancy said quietly, staring at her granddaughter. "I thought I'd be done, but when Sophie's parents couldn't, when they left," she swallowed hard. "She's all I've got." "How long have you been caring for her?" Emily asked gently. "Almost 2 years now. My son and his wife, they got mixed up in things they shouldn't have. One day they dropped Sophie off and never came back." Nancy's eyes filled with tears. "My heart is willing, but my body isn't cooperating anymore." As if sensing they were talking about her, Sophie stirred, her eyes fluttering open. When she saw her grandmother, her face lit up with the first genuine smile Emily had seen from her. "Grandma," she whispered, reaching out a small hand. That single word, filled with love and relief, told Emily everything she needed to know. This wasn't a case of negligence from lack of caring. It was a family drowning in circumstances beyond their control. As a social worker entered the room with a clipboard and a concerned expression, Emily realized this was just the beginning of a much longer journey. Emily sat in the hospital cafeteria, stirring a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. It was nearly 7 p.m., and the fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across her tired face. She'd called the school principal hours ago to explain her absence and arrange for a substitute teacher for tomorrow. What had started as a typical Monday had transformed into something she couldn't have imagined when she'd packed her lunch that morning. Her phone buzzed with a text from Nancy. "Sophie's asking for you." When Emily returned to the hospital room, Sophie was sitting up in bed, her teddy bear still clutched tightly against her chest. The IV in her arm made her appear even smaller and more vulnerable. "Miss Carter," Sophie said, softly, her voice stronger than it had been earlier. "You came back. I promised I wouldn't leave, didn't I?" Emily smiled, sitting on the edge of the bed. Nancy dozed in a chair nearby, exhaustion etched into every line of her face. The social worker had come and gone, leaving behind a stack of forms and a business card with a case number scribbled on the back. "The doctor says I have bugs in my tummy," Sophie whispered, her face serious, "but not the kind you can see crawling around." Emily nodded. "That's right, but the medicine they're giving you will make them go away." "Grandma says, I'm fine," Sophie continued, her eyes darting to her sleeping grandmother. "She says not to tell anyone when my tummy hurts because people might take me away." Emily's heart tightened. The fear in Sophie's voice was unmistakable, not fear of her grandmother, but fear of being separated from her. "Your grandma loves you very much," Emily said carefully. "Sometimes grown-ups worry about things because they care." Sophie nodded solemnly. "She cries when she thinks I'm sleeping." The following morning, Emily took a personal day and headed to the local Department of Family Services. The waiting room was packed, mothers bouncing fussy babies, tired-looking fathers filling out forms, children playing with worn toys in the corner. Every available chair was taken, with some people standing against the walls or sitting on the floor. After a 2-hour wait, Emily was finally called into a cramped office where a harried-looking woman introduced herself as Mrs. Daniels, the case manager assigned to Sophie. "I've reviewed the preliminary report from the hospital," Mrs. Daniels said, her desk piled high with manila folders. Phones rang constantly in the background, and through the thin walls Emily could hear raised voices from neighboring offices. "This is a clear case of neglect, though perhaps unintentional. Nancy Miller is doing her best," Emily insisted. "She needs support, not punishment." Mrs. Daniels sighed, removing her glasses to rub her eyes. "Ms. Carter, I have 37 active cases right now, 37 families in crisis. I'm supposed to have 15 at most." She gestured to the overflowing inbox on her desk. "These came in just this week." "What happens to Sophie now?" Emily asked. "Standard procedure would be temporary foster placement while we evaluate the grandmother's ability to provide adequate care." Mrs. Daniels typed something into her computer. "I can schedule a home evaluation in 3 weeks. 3 weeks? Sophie could be ready for discharge in days." "I understand your frustration, but—" "No, I don't think you do," Emily interrupted, immediately regretting her tone. "I'm sorry, it's just they belong together. There has to be a better way." As Emily left the building, a voice called out behind her. "Excuse me, I couldn't help overhearing." Emily turned to see an older woman with silver hair pulled into a neat bun. Despite the warm day, she wore a cardigan with a name badge clipped to it. Margaret Brown, social worker, retired. "I volunteer here twice a week," Margaret explained. "Been doing it since I retired 5 years ago. The system's more overwhelmed than I've ever seen it. Is there anything that can be done for Sophie and her grandmother?" Emily asked desperately. Margaret's eyes crinkled with compassion. "Official channels move slowly, but sometimes there are other ways to help families stay together." She handed Emily a business card. "Why don't you come by my home this evening? We can talk more freely there." As Emily took the card, she felt a small spark of hope ignite. Perhaps this retired social worker could help navigate a system that seemed designed to separate rather than support. "Grandma says I'm fine." Sophie's words echoed in Emily's mind as she walked to her car. The little girl with the teddy bear had already endured so much. Emily was determined to ensure she wouldn't lose the only family she had left. Margaret Brown's home was exactly what Emily had expected. A cozy bungalow with a meticulously maintained garden and wind chimes tinkling softly on the front porch. Inside, shelves overflowed with books on child development, social work, and psychology, testifying to decades dedicated to helping families in crisis. tea?" Margaret offered, leading Emily to a sunroom filled with potted plants and comfortable wicker furniture. "Thank you," Emily accepted, sinking into a chair. "I can't tell you how grateful I am for your help." Margaret's eyes twinkled as she poured from a floral teapot. "I haven't helped yet, but I've seen too many families torn apart by a system that's meant to protect them. Sometimes the most damaging thing we can do is follow protocol without considering the human cost." For the next hour, Emily detailed everything she knew about Sophie and Nancy, the hospital diagnosis, Nancy's physical limitations, the looming threat of foster placement, and the obvious love between grandmother and grandchild. Sophie was discharged this afternoon, Emily explained. Nancy took her home, but they have a follow-up appointment tomorrow. The doctor is concerned about Sophie's recovery environment. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "Before we discuss alternatives, I'd like to see their home situation for myself. Would you be comfortable taking me there tomorrow?" The following afternoon after school, Emily drove Margaret to the small apartment complex on the east side of town. The building was run down but clean, with potted geraniums lining the cracked walkway. Nancy opened the door after Emily's second knock, her face lighting up with recognition. "Ms. Carter, Sophie will be so happy to see you." The apartment was tiny, just one bedroom, a kitchenette, and a living area where a pull-out sofa showed signs of regular use. Everything was meticulously clean, though Emily noticed the furniture was threadbare and mismatched. Family photos lined the walls, including several of a younger Nancy with 2 teenage boys. Sophie sat at a small table, coloring carefully within the lines of a book Emily recognized from her classroom. When she spotted Emily, her face brightened. "Miss Carter, look what Grandma got me." She held up a new box of crayons. "Those are beautiful colors, Sophie." Emily smiled, noticing how the child already looked brighter, though still too thin. While Sophie showed Emily her drawings, Margaret spoke quietly with Nancy in the kitchen area. Emily couldn't hear everything, but she caught fragments. Nancy explaining her arthritis, her fixed income, the struggle to get to doctor's appointments without a car. "Some days my hands shake so bad I can't open the medicine bottles," Nancy admitted, demonstrating how her fingers curled involuntarily. "I never meant for Sophie to go hungry. I thought she was eating at school." After they'd been there almost an hour, Sophie tugged at Emily's hand. "Want to see my special place?" Emily followed Sophie to the bedroom, where a small corner had been transformed into a child sanctuary. A worn but clean quilt covered a reading nook, beside a tiny bookshelf. "This is where me and Beery read," Sophie explained, holding up her teddy bear. "He belonged to my mom." "Beery is very special then," Emily said gently. Sophie nodded solemnly. "Grandma says he's keeping Mom's love safe for me." She lowered her voice to a whisper. "Sometimes I pretend he talks to me when I'm scared." "What does he say?" Emily asked. "He says everything will be okay, that Grandma loves me and I should be brave." Sophie hugged the bear tighter. "Is that silly?" "Not at all," Emily assured her. "Everyone needs someone to talk to when they're scared." When they returned to the living room, Margaret was making notes while Nancy looked on anxiously. "Ms. Carter," Sophie asked suddenly, "will you come visit again?" Before Emily could answer, Nancy interjected, "Sophie, Ms. Carter is very busy with her other students." "Actually," Emily said, an idea forming, "I'd love to come by again. Maybe I could bring some books from school for us to read together?" The hope that blossomed on Sophie's face was like sunshine breaking through clouds. For the first time since Emily had known her, the little girl spoke more than a whispered sentence. "I like stories about brave girls and animals that can talk. And magic. Beery likes magic stories too." This small moment of animation, Sophie actually expressing a preference, sharing what she enjoyed, felt like a precious victory. Later, as they drove away, Margaret turned to Emily, with determination in her eyes. "You saw what I saw, didn't you? That's not a home lacking love, it's a home lacking resources." Emily nodded, gripping the steering wheel. What can we do? Something unorthodox, Margaret replied, a hint of rebellion in her voice. Something that might just work, if we can get enough people to believe in it as much as we do. As streetlights began to illuminate the darkening city, Emily felt a sense of purpose stronger than anything she'd experienced in her teaching career. Sophie's voice, animated for those few precious moments, replayed in her mind. It was a beginning, small but significant. The teacher's lounge at Pinewood Elementary was buzzing with conversation when Emily entered Wednesday morning. Conversations hushed momentarily as colleagues glanced her way. News of her sudden departure with Sophie in an ambulance had clearly spread. "How's the little Miller girl?" asked Mrs. Perez, the second-grade teacher who had been at Pinewood for over 20 years. "Recovering," Emily replied, pouring herself a much-needed cup of coffee. "But her situation is complicated." Principal Donovan stepped in, his tie slightly askew as always. "Emily, a word in my office when you have a moment." 30 minutes later, Emily left the principal's office with mixed feelings. While supportive of her concern for Sophie, Principal Donovan had gently reminded her about professional boundaries and the dangers of becoming too emotionally invested in a student's home situation. "We're educators, not social workers," he'd said kindly but firmly. "There are systems in place for these situations." Systems that were failing Sophie and Nancy, Emily thought as she walked to her classroom. During morning circle time, Emily noticed her students glancing at Sophie's empty desk. "Where's Sophie?" asked Lily, a bright-eyed girl with braided pigtails. "Sophie is taking a few days to get better," Emily explained. "Sometimes our bodies need extra rest and care." "Is she coming back?" asked another student. "I hope so," Emily answered honestly. "And I think we could do something special to welcome her when she does return." The children's eyes lit up with excitement as Emily suggested they create get-well cards for their classmate. As construction paper, markers, and glitter were distributed, Emily marveled at how quickly children embraced kindness when given the opportunity. After school, Emily met Margaret at a small cafe near the hospital. The retired social worker had spent the day making calls and pulling strings from her decades of connections in family services. "The news isn't good," Margaret said without preamble. "The preliminary home assessment is scheduled, but the caseworker is recommending temporary placement during the investigation." Emily's heart sank. "There has to be something we can do." "There might be," Margaret said, sliding a folder across the table. "I've been researching alternative care models. There's a program in Portland that created neighborhood care networks for families in similar situations." As Margaret outlined her idea, a community support system that would supplement Nancy's care for Sophie while keeping them together, Emily felt both hope and skepticism. "It sounds wonderful." "In theory, but who would volunteer? People are so busy with their own lives." The bell above the cafe door jingled, and Emily looked up to see Mrs. Perez entering with another teacher. "Emily, we were hoping to find you," Mrs. Perez said, approaching their table. "We wanted to know how we could help." "With your student, the one who was taken to the hospital." Before Emily could respond, the cafe owner, Mr. Chen, appeared with coffee refills. "I couldn't help overhearing," he said, his voice quiet. "This child, she lives with her grandmother in the Oak Ridge apartments?" Emily nodded, surprised. "My mother lived there before she passed," Mr. Chen continued. "Many elderly people living alone, struggling. I bring day-old pastries there sometimes." He hesitated. "If there is something more I could do." That evening, as Emily drove home, her mind raced with possibilities. She thought of Mr. Chen, of Mrs. Perez and the other teachers, of her neighbors and friends. Individual gestures of goodwill happened every day, but what if they could be coordinated, focused on one family in need? Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Nancy. "Ms. Carter, I hope I'm not bothering you." Nancy's voice sounded strained. "Sophie had a good day, but she's been asking when she can return to school. The doctor says maybe next week if her follow-up looks good." "That's wonderful news," Emily said. "The children made cards for her today." "That's That's very kind, Nancy replied, her voice catching. There's something else. A social worker called. They want to do a home visit tomorrow, and they mentioned temporary placement options. The fear in Nancy's voice was unmistakable. Mrs. Miller, Nancy, can I come over tonight? There's something I'd like to discuss. With you. An idea that might help. After they hung up, Emily made one more call to Margaret. I think it's starting, she said. The community is awakening. As streetlights illuminated her drive to the Oak Ridge apartments, Emily thought of Sophie's teddy bear, Beery, keeping watch over a little girl who had already faced too much uncertainty in her young life. Everything will be okay, Emily whispered, echoing Beery's imaginary reassurances. But unlike the stuffed bear's promises, Emily was determined to turn these words into reality. The kitchen table in Nancy and Sophie's apartment had become command central. Spread across its surface were calendars, contact lists, and meal plans, the beginnings of what Margaret called their community care strategy. Nancy sat quietly, her weathered hands wrapped around a mug of tea, her expression a mixture of hope and disbelief. You really think people will volunteer their time for us? She asked, eyeing the empty slots on the weekly schedule Emily had created. We're not charity cases. This isn't charity, Margaret explained gently. This is community. The same way neighbors used to look out for each other before we all got so isolated in our own little worlds. Sophie sat on the living room floor nearby, contentedly playing with a set of wooden blocks Emily had brought from her classroom. The child already looked healthier after just days of proper nutrition and medication, though her recovery would take time. I don't know most of these people, Nancy continued, glancing at the list of potential volunteers. But they know about Sophie, Emily assured her, and they want to help. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. It was Mr. Chen from the cafe carrying a large paper bag. Fresh soup, he explained, setting the bag on the counter. My mother's recipe, good for healing. He glanced at Sophie, then lowered his voice. My wife and I can provide dinner twice a week. We have the cafe, so it's no trouble. Nancy's eyes glistened. That's very kind, but please, Mr. Chen said firmly, it would honor my mother's memory. Before he left, Mr. Chen added his contact information to the schedule, committing to Tuesday and Friday meal deliveries. See, Emily said after he'd gone. One slot filled already. The home assessment was scheduled for 10 a.m. the next day. By 9:30, the apartment had been transformed. Mrs. Perez had arrived early with cleaning supplies and fresh linens. Mr. Johnson, the retired handyman from across the hall, had fixed the leaky faucet and the wobbly kitchen chair. The refrigerator was stocked with healthy foods from a grocery delivery organized by the school's parent association. When Ms. Daniels from Family Services arrived, she found a very different scene than she had anticipated. The apartment was spotless, the kitchen well stocked, and a schedule of community support prominently displayed on the refrigerator. This is unexpected, she commented, making notes on her clipboard. Margaret stepped forward, professional to professional. We've implemented a community care network to address the concerns raised in the initial report. As you can see, we have daily check-ins, meal assistance, transportation to medical appointments, and educational support. Ms. Daniels looked skeptical. And how long do you expect volunteers to maintain this level of involvement? These situations require long-term solutions, not temporary goodwill. It was a fair question, one that had kept Emily awake at night. Volunteers often started with enthusiasm but gradually drifted away as their own lives demanded attention. We're taking it 1 month at a time, Emily acknowledged, but we've created a rotating schedule to prevent burnout, and Margaret will be coordinating to ensure no gaps in care. As Ms. Daniels continued her assessment, Sophie approached Emily and tugged at her sleeve. Miss Carter, she whispered, her voice still so quiet Emily had to lean down to hear. Is that lady going to take me away from Grandma? Emily's heart clenched. We're doing everything we can to make sure you stay together. Sophie nodded solemnly, then whispered something that caught Emily off guard. I'm not supposed to tell, But sometimes there's no food in the kitchen. Beery and I pretend to have picnics instead. The innocent revelation, spoken without self-pity, just a simple statement of fact, strengthened Emily's resolve. No child should have to pretend to eat. When Ms. Daniels finished her inspection, her expression remained carefully neutral. I'll need to file my report. In the meantime, Sophie will remain with her grandmother, contingent upon this support system remaining in place. She turned to Nancy. There will be follow-up visits unannounced. After she left, Nancy collapsed into a chair, her hands trembling with relief. I thought for sure. It's just a first step, Margaret cautioned. We've bought some time, but we need to prove this can work long-term. That evening, as volunteers came and went, Mrs. Perez dropping off a backpack of school materials, Mr. Johnson returning with a repaired bathroom doorknob, a nursing student from the local college checking Nancy's medication system, Emily watched Sophie's expression gradually change from wariness to cautious acceptance. Before Emily left, Sophie showed her a drawing she'd made, stick figures of different sizes surrounding what appeared to be her and her grandmother. That's a lovely family picture, Emily said. Sophie shook her head. It's not family, it's helpers. She pointed to a tall stick figure with curly hair. That's you, Miss Carter. The simple drawing captured what they were attempting to create, not a replacement for family, but a supporting circle around it. A temporary solution, perhaps, but one that might just be enough to keep Sophie where she belonged. As Emily drove home, her phone chimed with a text from Margaret. First day complete. 29 more to go until our review. The countdown had begun. 2 weeks into their community care plan, Sophie returned to school. Emily watched from her classroom doorway as the little girl walked down the hallway, her hand firmly clasped in Nancy's. The transformation was remarkable. Sophie's cheeks had regained some color, and though still thin, she no longer appeared frail. Most noticeably, she walked with her head up rather than cast down at the floor. Good morning, Sophie. Emily greeted them warmly. We're so happy to have you back. Sophie offered a small smile, clutching Beery in her free arm. I finished all the worksheets you sent, she said, her voice soft but clear. Nancy squeezed her granddaughter's hand. She insisted on doing schoolwork even when the doctor said she should rest. After helping Sophie settle at her desk, Nancy pulled Emily aside. The social worker came by yesterday, unannounced just like she said she would. How did it go? Emily asked, keeping her voice low as children continued to file into the classroom. Fine, I think. Mr. Chen had just delivered dinner, and the nursing student, Alicia, was there. Checking my blood pressure. Nancy's voice dropped even lower. But Emily, they're scheduling a formal evaluation hearing in 2 weeks to decide permanent arrangements. The worry lines around Nancy's eyes had deepened, and Emily noticed how she kept glancing back at Sophie, as if afraid she might disappear at any moment. They took my neighbor's grandchildren last year, Nancy confided, her voice barely audible. I don't sleep thinking about it. Emily placed a reassuring hand on Nancy's arm. We'll be prepared. Margaret has experience with these hearings, and we have documentation of all the progress we've made. But as Nancy left and the school day began, Emily couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. Their community care network was functioning well, but would it be enough to satisfy the court? And more importantly, could they sustain it long enough to make a difference? During morning circle time, Emily invited Sophie to share something about her time away from school if she wanted to. The other children waited expectantly. They had created a welcome back banner that hung across the chalkboard, decorated with their handprints and messages of friendship. The doctors fixed my tummy, Sophie said simply, hugging Beery close. And now lots of people come to our house to help Grandma. That must be nice, said Lily, the girl with braided pigtails. Sophie considered this for a moment. Sometimes it's scary, she admitted. New people all the time, but miss you. Carter comes almost every day. She glanced up at Emily with such trust that it made Emily's heart ache. Later that afternoon, while the children were at music class, Principal Donovan stopped by Emily's empty classroom. "How's it going with the Miller situation?" he asked, his tone concerned rather, then accusatory. "Sophie's doing better," Emily replied. "The community support has been amazing." Principal Donovan nodded, then hesitated. "Emily, some of the other teachers have expressed concern about your level of involvement. They worry you're taking on too much, becoming too emotionally attached to this case." "It's not a case," Emily said, more sharply than she intended. "It's a child and her grandmother." "I understand," he said gently. "But you have 23 other children who need you too. And from what I hear, you've been spending evenings and weekends coordinating this. Volunteer network." Emily couldn't deny it. Her living room looked much like Nancy's kitchen table, covered in schedules, phone numbers, and contingency plans. She'd canceled dinner with friends twice, postponed visiting her parents, and stayed up late most nights making calls and sending emails to ensure no gaps in their support system. "I'm managing," she insisted. Principal Donovan sighed. "Just be careful. Remember why you became a teacher in the first place, to help many children, not just one." His words lingered with Emily as she picked up her students from music class. Was she crossing a line, becoming too involved? Or was this exactly what teaching was about, seeing a need and responding with everything you had? That evening, as Emily sat at Nancy's kitchen table reviewing medication schedules, Sophie appeared in her pajamas, Beery tucked under her arm. "Miss Carter, can I ask you something?" Her blue eyes were serious. "Of course, sweetheart. If the people in suits take me away from Grandma, will you still visit me?" The question, asked so directly, caught Emily off guard. She'd been careful not to discuss the upcoming hearing in front of Sophie. But children always seemed to sense when adults were worried. "Sophie, many people are working very hard to make sure you stay with your grandma," Emily answered carefully. Sophie nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "Barry is scared," she whispered. "He remembers when my mom and dad left and never came back." Emily felt her professional distance crumbling as she gathered Sophie into a gentle hug. "Whatever happens," she promised, "you won't be forgotten or alone. Not ever again." As Sophie returned to bed, Emily caught sight of Nancy watching from the hallway, tears streaming silently down her weathered cheeks. 2 weeks until the hearing. 2 weeks to prove that love, combined with community support, could be enough. Saturday morning dawned bright and clear. Perfect weather for Pinewood Elementary's annual fall festival. The school playground had been transformed with colorful booths, games, and a small petting zoo. Children darted between activities, their laughter carrying on the crisp autumn breeze. Emily had volunteered for the face painting station, where a line of eager children waited for butterflies, superheroes, and animals to be painted on their cheeks. She scanned the growing crowd, wondering if Sophie and Nancy would come. She had left tickets in their mailbox yesterday, along with a note encouraging them to join the festivities. "Need some help?" A familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. It was Margaret, wearing a Pinewood Elementary volunteer badge and carrying a canvas bag. "Margaret, I didn't know you were volunteering today." The retired social worker smiled. "I thought it might be good to see Sophie in a social setting before the hearing. Observational evidence can be powerful." As they set up the face painting supplies, Margaret lowered her voice. "Emily, there's something I haven't told you about why this case matters so much to me." Emily looked up, surprised by Margaret's serious tone. 23 years ago, I handled a case similar to Sophie's, a child living with an elderly grandparent who was struggling but deeply loving. Margaret's eyes grew distant with memory. Following protocol, I recommended temporary placement while the grandfather improved his situation. The child was placed in foster care, supposedly for just a few months. She paused, arranging paintbrushes with careful precision. The grandfather had a heart attack 2 weeks later. The child never got to say goodbye, and bounced between foster homes until aging out of the system. Emily's heart sank. "That's awful. That child was Jordan Chen." "Mr. Chen? From the cafe?" Emily whispered, stunned by the connection. Margaret nodded. He doesn't. No, I was the social worker who separated him from his grandfather, and I've never found the courage to tell him. She looked directly at Emily. That's why I'm determined to help Sophie and Nancy stay together. Some mistakes you never stop trying to make right. Before Emily could respond, she spotted Sophie and Nancy making their way slowly toward the festival entrance. Nancy leaned heavily on her cane, and Sophie walked patiently beside her, pointing excitedly at the colorful decorations. Beery, as always, was tucked securely under her arm. They came. Emily smiled, waving to catch their attention. The morning passed in a blur of face painting and conversations. Emily watched as Sophie cautiously joined a ring of children playing Duck, Duck, Goose, not participating yet, but standing close enough to be included in the circle. Nancy sat on a nearby bench, chatting with Mrs. Perez and other parents who had become part of their support network. During her break, Emily brought cotton candy to Sophie and Nancy. As they sat together on the bench, Sophie's face sticky with pink sugar, Emily marveled at the change in the little girl, though still quiet compared to most. Children her age, Sophie now made eye contact when spoken to, and occasionally even initiated conversations. "Miss Carter," Sophie said, offering a piece of cotton candy to Beery before taking another bite herself. "Grandma says you're helping us stay together." Emily glanced at Nancy, unsure how respond. Nancy stroked Sophie's hair gently. "That's right, sweetheart. Ms. Carter and many other kind people are helping us." "Like a team?" Sophie asked. "Exactly like a team," Emily agreed. Sophie considered this, then said something that caught both women by surprise. "My mom had a team too, but her team didn't help her get better." Nancy's hand stilled on Sophie's head. It was the first time Emily had heard Sophie mention her mother directly. "Your mom faced different challenges, honey," Nancy said carefully. Sophie nodded, her expression wise beyond her years. "She was sick in a way doctors couldn't fix. That's what you told me." The simple statement opened a window into conversations that must have happened between grandmother and granddaughter. Honest, age-appropriate explanations of why Sophie's parents were absent. "Sophie," Emily said gently, "would you like to get your face painted? I can do a butterfly or a tiger or anything you want." Sophie's face brightened. "Can you paint a bear? Like Beery?" At the face painting booth, Sophie sat perfectly still as Emily carefully painted a small brown bear on her cheek. As she worked, Sophie whispered something so quietly that Emily had to lean closer to hear. "I'm glad you're on our team, Miss Carter." Later, as the festival wound down, Emily spotted Mr. Chen helping to pack up the food booth. Remembering Margaret's revelation, she watched him interact with the volunteers, his genuine smile, his patience with the children, his generosity with leftover treats. Somehow, despite the system failing him, he had become a person who gave back. As Sophie and Nancy prepared to leave, Emily noticed Sophie showing her bare face paint to Beery, explaining that now they matched. The simple joy in this gesture, the connection between a little girl and her stuffed companion, reminded Emily why their fight mattered so much. Some bonds, once broken, could never be truly repaired. Emily was determined that Sophie and Nancy would not have to discover that painful truth. The downtown family services building loomed, gray and imposing against the morning sky. Emily, Margaret, and Nancy sat in hard plastic chairs in a sterile conference room, waiting for the evaluation hearing to begin. Sophie was in a children's area down the hall, supervised by a court-appointed child advocate. "Remember," Margaret whispered, "let me do most of the talking. We have documentation of Sophie's improvement, the community care plan, and letters of support." Nancy nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she straightened her best blouse, a faded floral print that had been carefully ironed. Emily had arrived early that morning to help her prepare, making sure both grandmother and granddaughter looked their best for this crucial meeting. The door opened, and 3 people entered. Ms. Daniels, the caseworker they already knew, a stern-looking woman introduced as Mrs. Winters, the department supervisor, and a young man with a laptop who would be recording the proceedings. Mrs. Winters began without preamble, her voice brisk and impersonal. "We're here to evaluate the placement of Sophie Miller, age 6, currently in the custody of her grandmother, Nancy Miller, age 72. As she spoke, the young man typed. Rapidly, Sophie's life reduced to case numbers and clinical terminology on his screen. Emily watched Nancy's expression grow increasingly anxious as Mrs. Winters read aloud from a report detailing the incident at school, Sophie's medical diagnosis, and concerns about Nancy's ability to provide adequate care. "While we acknowledge the improvement in Sophie's condition," Mrs. Winters continued, glancing at the documentation Margaret had submitted, "we must consider the long-term sustainability of this arrangement." Margaret leaned forward. "If I may, Mrs. Winters, we've implemented a community support network that addresses all areas of concern. Sophie's health has improved significantly. She's thriving at school and—" "Ms. Brown," Mrs. Winters interrupted, "while your volunteer efforts are commendable, they don't change the fundamental issue. Mrs. Miller's advanced age and health limitations present ongoing concerns for a child as young as Sophie." Emily watched in dismay as Mrs. Winters placed Sophie's file on top of an enormous stack of folders, each representing another child, another family in crisis. The visual reminder of an overwhelmed system was stark and disheartening. "Our recommendation," Mrs. Winters stated, "is temporary placement in a licensed foster home while Mrs. Miller receives additional assessment and support services." Nancy made a small, wounded sound, quickly stifled by her hand. "For how long?" Emily asked, unable to remain silent. "That depends on Mrs. Miller's progress and cooperation. Typically, these placements last a minimum of 3 months. 3 months. Emily thought of Sophie's question. "If the people in suits take me away from Grandma, will you still visit me?" She thought of the trust they had built, the progress Sophie had made, and how fragile that progress remained. "May I speak?" Nancy's voice was quiet but steady. Mrs. Winters nodded, though her expression suggested she had already made her decision. "I know I'm old," Nancy began. "My hands shake, my knees hurt, and some days I can barely open a jar of applesauce. But I love that child more than anything in this world. She's already lost her parents. Please don't let her lose me too." The simple, heartfelt plea hung in the air. For a moment, the sterile room fell completely silent. Then from the doorway came a small voice. "Grandma?" They turned to see Sophie standing there, her child advocate a few steps behind with an apologetic expression. She insisted on finding her grandmother, the advocate explained. Sophie ran to Nancy, burying her face in her grandmother's lap. "Don't let them take me away," she whispered loud enough for everyone to hear. "Please, I'll be good." As Nancy wrapped her arms around Sophie, Emily saw Mrs. Winters' expression shift almost imperceptibly. The supervisor glanced at the stack of case files, then back at the grandmother and child clinging to each other. For the first time, Sophie wasn't just another folder in the pile. She was a little girl, terrified of losing the only family she had left. The silence in Emily's car was heavy as she drove Nancy and Sophie home from the Family Services building. The hearing had ended with a compromise. Sophie would remain with Nancy for now, but with weekly monitoring visits and a final decision to be made in 30 days. It wasn't the victory they had hoped for, but it wasn't defeat either, just more uncertainty. 30 days, Nancy murmured, gazing out the window. What more can we possibly do in 30 days to convince them? In the backseat, Sophie had fallen asleep, emotionally exhausted from the morning's events. Beery was tucked securely under her arm, his worn fur catching the afternoon sunlight. "We keep going," Emily said firmly, though her own confidence had been shaken by Mrs. Winters' skepticism about their community. "Care plan. We document everything, we strengthen our network, and we prove them wrong." That evening, after settling Nancy and Sophie at home with dinner provided by Mr. Chen, Emily found herself unable to rest. Sitting at her kitchen table, surrounded by notes from the hearing, she felt a growing Frustration with a system that seemed designed to separate rather than support. Her phone lit up with a text from Margaret. "Don't give up. Meeting tomorrow, 7 p.m., my house, bringing reinforcements." The next evening, Emily arrived at Margaret's bungalow to find the sunroom already filled with people. Mr. Chen from the cafe, Mrs. Perez from school, the nursing student who helped with Nancy's medications, and several others who had become part of their support network. "I thought it was time we all met face to face," Margaret explained, passing around cups of tea. "We need a more coordinated approach for these next 30 days. Emily noticed a stack of papers on Margaret's coffee table, printouts of articles and case studies that hadn't been there during her previous visit. "What's all this research?" she asked. Margaret's eyes lit up with purpose. "After yesterday's hearing, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what Mrs. Winters said about the fundamental issue of Nancy's age and health. So I started digging." She spread the papers across the table. "It turns out there are programs in several states specifically designed to support grandparents raising grandchildren. They call them Grand Family Connection Initiatives. The articles detailed community-based models where elderly caregivers received structured support, from regular health monitoring to respite care to legal advocacy. This one in Oregon reduced foster placements by 60% in cases like Sophie's," Margaret pointed out. "And this model in Minnesota provides specialized training for the volunteers, making the support network more sustainable." Emily felt a spark of hope ignite as she scanned the materials. "Could we implement something like this here?" "That's why I've gathered everyone," Margaret replied. "We've been working as individuals with good intentions. Now we need to become an organized system with proven methods." Mr. Chen leaned forward, examining one of the articles. "My cafe could become a meeting place for other grandparents in similar situations," he suggested. "A support group of sorts." Mrs. Perez nodded enthusiastically. "And the school could offer extended day programs for the children, giving the grandparents a break." As ideas flowed around the room, Emily noticed a quiet woman in the corner whom she didn't recognize. Following her gaze, Margaret made introductions. "Emily, this is Lisa Warren. She works for Councilwoman Bishop's office." Lisa smiled. "Margaret called me yesterday. The councilwoman has been looking for community initiatives to support as part of her family preservation platform. This could be exactly what she's been waiting for." For the first time since the hearing, Emily felt genuine optimism. What had started as an emergency response to one child's crisis was evolving into something bigger, a potential model that could help many families caught in similar circumstances. As the meeting continued, plans emerged for a more formalized support structure, complete with training protocols, sustainable funding options, and official backing from the councilwoman's office. "We have 30 days, Emily reminded the group as the evening concluded. 30 days to turn our makeshift support network into something the system can't ignore." Later, driving home under a canopy of stars, Emily thought of Sophie, sleeping peacefully tonight, unaware of the movement building around her. Sometimes the biggest changes began with the smallest seeds. A teacher noticing a quiet child, a community refusing to look away, a system finally forced to bend. 2 weeks had passed since the meeting at Margaret's house, and Councilwoman Bishop's office had become the unofficial headquarters for what they now called the Grand Family Connection Initiative. The walls were covered with flowcharts, schedules, and statistics. The blueprint for a community support system designed to keep families like Sophie and Nancy together. Emily stood before the assembled group, social workers, educators, healthcare providers, and community volunteers, feeling both nervous and determined. Today, they would present their proposal to Mrs. Winters and the Family Services Department, hoping to change minds before Sophie's final hearing. "Remember," Lisa Warren cautioned as they gathered their materials, "bureaucracy doesn't change overnight. Be prepared for resistance." When they arrived at the Family Services building, Mrs. Winters was waiting in the same sterile conference room, where Sophie's fate had been discussed weeks earlier. Her expression remained professionally neutral as Margaret introduced their team and outlined their proposal. "We've developed a structured support system based on successful models in other states," Margaret explained, distributing carefully prepared folders. "It addresses all the concerns raised about Sophie's case while establishing a framework that could benefit many families in similar situations." Mrs. Winters flipped through the materials, her expression unchanged. "This is, certainly comprehensive," she acknowledged. "But what makes you think volunteers can replace professional foster care?" Emily stepped forward. "We're not trying to replace the foster system, Mrs. Winters. We're proposing a way to prevent unnecessary placements when families could remain together. With proper support, you expect volunteers to maintain this level of commitment indefinitely?" Mrs. Winters raised an eyebrow. "In my experience, community enthusiasm fades quickly. That's why we've incorporated training programs, rotating schedules, and sustainable funding through the councilwoman's office," Lisa interjected. "This isn't just about one child anymore, it's about creating lasting change." For the next hour, they presented data, testimonials, and concrete plans. Emily watched Mrs. Winters's face for any sign of softening, but the supervisor maintained her professional skepticism. "The department appreciates your efforts," Mrs. Winters said finally, closing her folder. "But Sophie's case must be evaluated according to established protocols. The final hearing remains scheduled for next Friday." As they left the building, disappointment hung heavy in the air. "She didn't commit to anything," Emily said, trying to hide her frustration. Margaret squeezed her arm reassuringly. "She didn't say no either, and she took our materials. That's something." Back at school, Emily found it difficult to focus on teaching. Sophie had continued to improve over the past weeks, participating more in class, gaining weight, even making a few friends. The thought of disrupting this progress, of watching Sophie's trust shatter when she was separated from Nancy, was unbearable. During recess, Emily noticed Sophie sitting on a bench with Lily, the girl with braided pigtails. To her surprise, Sophie was talking animatedly, showing Lily how to make Beery dance by moving his paws. The sound of Sophie's giggle, a sound Emily had never heard before, drifted across the playground. That afternoon, Emily was grading papers when Principal Donovan appeared at her classroom door. "Emily, there's someone here to see you." To her surprise, Mrs. Winters stood in the doorway, her usual portfolio clutched in her hands. "Ms. Carter, I wonder if I might observe Sophie in her classroom environment. It would help provide a more complete picture for our assessment." Emily quickly agreed, though apprehension twisted in her stomach. Was this a good sign or merely procedural thoroughness? For the next hour, Mrs. Winters sat quietly at the back of the classroom while Emily conducted a science lesson on the life cycle of butterflies. Sophie raised her hand twice to answer questions, something that would have been unimaginable just weeks ago. When the children left for art class, Mrs. Winters approached Emily's desk. "She seems to be doing well," she observed, her voice giving away nothing. "She's thriving," Emily confirmed. "And it's not just her physical health. She's developing socially and emotionally, too." Mrs. Winters nodded, making a note in her file. "I've reviewed your Grand Family Connection proposal more thoroughly. It's impressive." "Then you'll consider it?" Emily asked hopefully. "I've been doing this job for 23 years, Ms. Carter," Mrs. Winters replied, her professional mask slipping just slightly. "I've seen many well-intentioned efforts come and go. What makes yours different?" The question didn't sound dismissive. It seemed genuinely curious, perhaps even hopeful. "Because it's not just mine," Emily answered simply. "It belongs to an entire community that refuses to let systems fail the people they were designed to protect." For the first time, Emily saw something shift in Mrs. Winters's expression. Not quite approval, but perhaps the beginning of consideration. As Mrs. Winters turned to leave, she paused at the door. "The final hearing is still scheduled for Friday, But I will be reviewing all aspects of this case very carefully before then. It wasn't a promise, but it was a crack in the door. And sometimes, Emily thought as she watched Mrs. Winters walk away, that was all you, needed to let the light in. The week before Sophie's final hearing passed in a blur of activity. Emily divided her time between teaching, coordinating volunteers, and helping Nancy prepare for what might be the most important day of her life. The Grand Family Connection initiative had taken on a momentum of its own, with Councilwoman Bishop officially endorsing the program at a community meeting covered by the local newspaper. Remember to bring all of Sophie's medical records, Emily reminded Nancy as they sat at the kitchen table reviewing their checklist, and the attendance reports from school showing her improvement. Nancy nodded, carefully placing documents into a folder. Her hands were steadier these days, a result of the new medication regimen established by Dr. Martinez, a geriatric specialist who had volunteered his services after reading about their cause. Do you think it will be enough? Nancy asked, voicing the fear that haunted them both. Before Emily could answer, Sophie emerged from her bedroom in pajamas, Beery tucked under one arm and a book clutched in her hand. "Grandma, it's story time," she announced, her voice clear and expectant. A far cry from the whispered words of the child Emily had first met. "I'll be right there, sweetheart," Nancy promised. Emily watched as Sophie climbed onto the sofa, arranging herself and Beery carefully against the cushions. These evening reading sessions had become sacred rituals, moments of normalcy amid the uncertainty that still clouded their future. "You go ahead," Emily smiled, gathering her notes. "I'll see you both tomorrow." As she reached the door, Sophie called out, "Miss Carter, will you come to story time tomorrow?" The simple invitation, evidence of Sophie's growing confidence and trust, caught Emily by surprise. "I'd love to," she replied, her heart full. Outside, the evening air carried the first hints of winter. Emily wrapped her scarf tighter as she walked to her car, thinking about how much had changed in the weeks since she'd first noticed Sophie's distress in her classroom. A community had awakened, systems were being challenged, and a little girl who once barely spoke now invited people into her world. The next morning, Emily arrived at school early to find Principal Donovan waiting in her classroom. "Emily, have you seen this?" He handed her a copy of the local newspaper. The headline read, "Local Initiative Challenges Child Welfare Approach." Beneath it was a photo of the community meeting at Councilwoman Bishop's office, with Emily visible in the background. "Is this going to be a problem?" Emily asked cautiously, remembering his earlier warnings about professional boundaries. Principal Donovan surprised her with a smile. "Actually, I've been approached by the superintendent. They're interested in making Pinewood a pilot school for the Grand Family Connection's educational support component." "Really?" Emily couldn't hide her astonishment. "Sometimes challenging the system is exactly what the system needs," he said, his eyes crinkling warmly. "You've reminded all of us what advocacy really means." Throughout the day, Emily noticed Sophie interacting more with her classmates, sharing crayons during art, joining a group at lunch, even participating in a game of tag during recess. Each small step toward normal childhood activities felt like a victory. After school, Emily drove to the cafe where Mr. Chen had arranged a special gathering. When she arrived, she found the back room transformed. A banner reading "Grand Family Support Group" hung across one wall, and several elderly people sat at tables with young children. "Our first meeting," Mr. Chen explained proudly. "Word is spreading. These are all grandparents raising grandchildren, just like Nancy." Emily watched as Nancy, who had arrived earlier, engaged in animated conversation with a woman around her age who had a young boy about Sophie's age sitting shyly beside her. Sophie and the boy were comparing stuffed animals, Sophie with Beery and the boy with a well-loved stuffed dinosaur. "They're building their own community," Margaret observed, appearing at Emily's side. "This is what sustainable support looks like." As the afternoon progressed, Emily witnessed something remarkable. Nancy shifting from someone receiving help to someone offering it. She explained medication organizers to another grandmother, shared tips for stretching a fixed income. and listened with genuine empathy to stories that echoed her own struggles. "She's found her strength," Margaret noted. "That's more powerful than any testimony we could present at tomorrow's hearing." Later, as promised, Emily joined Nancy and Sophie for story time. Sitting on the small sofa, listening to Nancy read The Little Engine That Could, with Sophie nestled against her side, Emily allowed herself to hope. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight, in this moment of perfect belonging, the bridges they had built between people, between systems, between generations, felt sturdy enough to carry them all forward. "I think I can, I think I can," Nancy read from the book, her voice strong and sure. Sophie, who clearly knew the story by heart, whispered along with the words. Emily joined in too, the simple mantra becoming their shared prayer for what lay ahead. The evening before Sophie's final hearing should have been a time for last-minute preparation and quiet confidence. The community support network was functioning smoothly. Sophie's health had improved dramatically, and Councilwoman Bishop had publicly endorsed their initiative. Everything seemed perfectly aligned for a positive outcome. Then Emily's phone rang at 9 p.m. "Emily?" Nancy's voice was tight with panic. "Sophie's running a fever. It came on suddenly after dinner." Emily's heart sank. "How high?" 102. "She's never sick, not since the hospital. I don't understand what happened." "I'm on my way," Emily said, already reaching for her car keys. When Emily arrived at the apartment, she found Sophie curled on the sofa, her face flushed and her breathing rapid. Beery was clutched against her chest, and Nancy sat beside her, pressing a cool cloth to her forehead. "Has she taken any medicine?" Emily asked, placing a gentle hand on Sophie's cheek to feel the heat radiating from her skin. Nancy nodded. "Children's Tylenol, about an hour ago. It hasn't seemed to help much." Emily checked the medicine cabinet, confirming the dosage was correct. "What about dinner? Was it something new? Leftover soup from the cafe? We've had it before with no problems." A quick check of Sophie's symptoms, fever, stomachache, slight headache, suggested nothing more serious than a common virus. But the timing couldn't have been worse. If Sophie was too ill to attend the hearing, tomorrow, would it be postponed? Or worse, would her illness be seen as evidence that their care system was failing? "Should we take her to the emergency room?" Nancy asked, wringing her hands. Emily considered this carefully. An unnecessary ER visit could deplete Nancy's limited resources and expose Sophie to other illnesses. But ignoring potentially serious symptoms wasn't an option either. "Let's call Dr. Martinez first," Emily suggested, referring to the geriatric specialist who had been helping Nancy. Though not a pediatrician, he had connections throughout the medical community. 20 minutes later, a pediatric nurse practitioner named Valerie arrived at the apartment. Dr. Martinez had called in a favor, arranging for a house call that would have been impossible through normal channels. After examining Sophie carefully, Valerie's diagnosis was reassuring. "It's just a virus going around. Several children in my practice have had it this week. With rest and fluids, she should improve by tomorrow afternoon." Relief washed over Nancy's face. "So it's nothing serious? Nothing related to her previous condition?" "Not at all," Valerie confirmed. "Just bad timing." As Valerie prepared to leave, she paused at the door. "Dr. Martinez mentioned your situation. I'd be happy to call the Family Services Department tomorrow morning to explain Sophie's condition if that would help." Emily thanked her gratefully, recognizing yet another thread in the web of support they had woven around this small family. After Valerie left, Emily helped Nancy settle Sophie more comfortably for the night. The little girl's eyes fluttered open briefly. "Miss Carter," she murmured, "will I be better for the meeting with the important people?" Emily's heart clenched at the realization that even in her feverish state, Sophie understood what was at stake tomorrow. "Don't worry about that now, sweetheart. Just rest and get better." Sophie nodded drowsily, then whispered, "Beery says everything happens for a reason." Emily stayed until Sophie fell asleep, then stepped into the kitchen where Nancy was making tea with trembling hands. "This isn't going to look good tomorrow, is it?" Nancy asked, her voice barely audible. "It's just a childhood illness," Emily reassured her. "Every child gets sick regardless of who's caring for them." But Nancy's worry had taken root in Emily's mind as well. Their community care system wasn't perfect. No system was. There had been small setbacks along the way. A volunteer who quit after 2 weeks, medication refills that were delayed, a day when the scheduled ride to a doctor's appointment never showed up. They had addressed each issue and improved their processes, but would the decision-makers see their responsiveness as a strength or view the problems as evidence of instability? As Emily finally drove home in the dark, fatigue and worry competed for dominance. The Grand Family Connection initiative had accomplished so much in so little time, but moments like tonight reminded her of its fragility. Real life didn't follow neat plans or schedules. Children got sick, volunteers had emergencies of their own, and systems, even carefully designed ones, experienced growing pains. Tomorrow would test not just the strength of their community network, but its resilience in the face of unexpected challenges. As Emily pulled into her driveway, her phone chimed with a text from Margaret. "Whatever happens tomorrow, remember how far we've come." This was never just about one hearing or one child. The reminder brought a measure of peace. Whatever the outcome tomorrow, they had already changed something fundamental in their community. The understanding that family preservation required more than good intentions. It required sustained, organized support. With that thought providing some comfort, Emily finally allowed herself to rest, knowing that tomorrow would bring its own challenges and perhaps its own unexpected grace. The Family Services building seemed even more imposing on the morning of the final hearing. Gray clouds hung low in the sky, threatening rain as Emily, Margaret, and Lisa from Councilwoman Bishop's office huddled under the concrete overhang, waiting for Nancy and Sophie to arrive. "Are you sure they're coming?" Lisa asked, checking her watch for the 3rd time. The hearing was scheduled to begin in 15 minutes, and there was still no sign of them. "Mr. Chen is driving them," Emily explained, trying to mask her own concern. Sophie was still running a fever this morning, but Nancy insisted they wouldn't miss this. Just as the words left her mouth, Mr. Chen's battered station wagon pulled into the parking lot. Emily hurried to meet them, her heart sinking when she saw Sophie's flushed face. The little girl was bundled in a sweater despite the mild temperature, and Beery was clutched tightly in her arms. "Her fever's down to 100, Nancy reported, her own face pale with worry. The nurse practitioner called it in to Mrs. Winters, explaining the situation. Inside, they were directed to the same conference room as before, but the atmosphere felt different today. Instead of just Mrs. Winters and the caseworker, a panel of 5 people sat at the table, representatives from various departments who would collectively decide Sophie's fate. Mrs. Winters began by introducing everyone and outlining the purpose of the hearing. Her tone was formal, but Emily noticed she made eye contact with Sophie and offered a small smile, a humanity that had been absent in their previous interactions. "Before we begin," Mrs. Winters said, "I want to acknowledge that Sophie is recovering from a virus. We appreciate your commitment to being here today, despite the circumstances." The first hour of the hearing proceeded methodically. Reports were presented on Sophie's medical progress, her school attendance and performance, and the structure of the community support network. Margaret and Lisa outlined the Grand Family Connection initiative in detail, emphasizing its sustainability and the official backing it had received. Throughout the presentations, Sophie sat quietly beside Nancy, occasionally whispering to Barry or sipping from a water bottle. Despite her illness, she seemed calm, a stark contrast to the terrified child who had clung to her grandmother during their first evaluation. When it was time for questions, the panel's inquiries were pointed and challenging. "You expect me to believe a few volunteers can replace the foster system?" asked an older man, representing the legal department. "We're not replacing it," Margaret corrected firmly. We're preventing unnecessary placements when families could stay together with proper support. And what happens when the novelty wears off and volunteers move on to the next cause? Asked another panel member. Lisa stepped in with details about training programs, rotating schedules, and the dedicated funding secured through the councilwoman's office. Emily added examples of how they had already handled volunteer turnover and other challenges. As the questioning continued, Emily noticed Sophie becoming increasingly restless. The little girl whispered something to Nancy, who shook her head slightly, but Sophie persisted. Finally, Nancy turned to Mrs. Winters. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but Sophie has something she wants to say. Would that be allowed?" The panel members exchanged surprised glances, but Mrs. Winters nodded. "Of course." Sophie stood up, still holding Beery tightly. Her voice was scratchy from her illness, but clear enough to be heard by everyone in the room. "I know I'm just a kid," she began, her blue eyes moving from one adult face to another. "But I think grown-ups forget what it's like to be little sometimes." The room fell silent as Sophie continued. "When my mom and dad left, I thought maybe it was my fault. Maybe if I was better, they would have stayed. Grandma says that's not true, but sometimes I still think it." Emily felt tears pricking at her eyes as Sophie spoke with a wisdom beyond her years. "Beery and Grandma are my family. Miss Carter and Mr. Chen and everyone else. They help us, but they're not the same as family." She paused, hugging Beery closer. "If you take me away from Grandma, you'll be taking away the only person who remembers what my mom looked like when she smiled. The only person who knows the bedtime songs my dad used to sing." One of the panel members wiped discreetly at her eyes as Sophie finished her unexpected speech. "Grandma needs help sometimes. But don't we all? That's what Miss Carter says. Everyone needs help. Sometimes." With that, Sophie returned to her seat, leaning against Nancy's side with the exhaustion of illness and emotion. The remainder of the hearing passed in a blur. Final statements were made, additional questions answered, and then the panel asked everyone except the decision-makers to step outside while they deliberated. In the hallway, Nancy held Sophie close, both of them trembling slightly. Emily, Margaret, Lisa, and Mr. Chen, who had returned after parking his car, formed a protective circle around them, the living embodiment of the community support they had described in such detail. "No matter what happens," Emily said softly, "remember that you are never alone. Not anymore." As they waited for the decision that would shape so many lives, Sophie closed her eyes, whispering something only Beery could hear. Perhaps a prayer, perhaps a promise, perhaps simply the innocent hope of a child who, despite everything, still believed in the goodness of the world. Spring had arrived at Pinewood Elementary. The playground echoed with laughter as children shed winter coats in favor of lighter jackets, and tiny green buds appeared on the trees lining the schoolyard. Emily stood by the classroom window, watching as her students enjoyed the season's first truly warm day. Her gaze drifted naturally to Sophie, who was playing hopscotch with Lily and two other girls. The change in Sophie over the past 4 months was nothing short of remarkable. No longer the silent, withdrawn child clutching a teddy bear, she now moved with confidence, her laughter joining the chorus of playground sounds. Beery still accompanied Sophie to school each day, but he spent most of his time safely tucked in her backpack, a security blanket gradually becoming less necessary as Sophie's world expanded. The memory of that final hearing day still brought tears to Emily's eyes. After deliberating for what felt like hours, the panel had returned with their decision. Sophie would remain permanently with Nancy, with the Grand Family Connection initiative providing ongoing support and regular monitoring. Mrs. Winters herself had delivered the news, her professional demeanor softening as she explained, "This case has challenged us to reconsider our approach to family preservation. Sometimes the system needs to adapt to the family, not the other way around." The Grand Family Connection had flourished in the months since. What began as an emergency response to one child's crisis had grown into a model program serving 15 families, with plans to expand throughout the district. Councilwoman Bishop had secured stable funding, and the state was considering legislation based on their framework. As for Nancy and Sophie, their lives had found a new rhythm. Nancy's health had improved with regular medical attention, and their apartment now served as an informal gathering place for other grandparents and grandchildren in the program. The school bell rang, signaling the end of recess. Emily watched as Sophie said goodbye to her friends and turned toward the building. Catching sight of Emily at the window, Sophie waved enthusiastically, her smile bright in the spring sunshine. Later that afternoon, as children packed up for dismissal, Sophie approached Emily's desk with a folded paper in her hand. "I made this for you," she said, placing the carefully crafted card on Emily's desk. Inside was a crayon drawing of many people holding hands in a circle. In the center stood 3 figures labeled me, Grandma, and Beery. Around them were smaller figures representing all the people who had become part of their support network. At the bottom, in Sophie's improving handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for seeing me when I was invisible." Emily knelt down to Sophie's level, her heart full. "You were never invisible, Sophie. Not really. Sometimes people just need to learn how to look more carefully." Sophie nodded with the simple wisdom of a child who had experienced both the failure and redemption of human systems. "Grandma says one person can change everything. She says you did." "We all did," Emily corrected gently. "That's the most important lesson in all of this. We're stronger together than we are alone." As Sophie joined Nancy waiting at the classroom door, Emily thought about how a single moment of attention, noticing a quiet child's distress on an ordinary Monday morning, had rippled outward, transforming not just one family but an entire community's understanding of what it meant to truly care for one another. Some battles were too big to fight alone, but with bridges built between people who refused to look away from suffering, even the most entrenched systems could change. And sometimes, the smallest voices, like Sophie's in that final hearing, spoke the truths that everyone needed to hear. "See you tomorrow, Miss Carter," Sophie called as she left, hand in hand with her grandmother. "See you tomorrow," Emily replied, certain now that there would indeed be many tomorrows, and that they would face them as they had faced everything else together.